I was there when she took her last breath. Not in the room, I made sure of that. But I was there, in the parking lot of Meadowview Assisted Living, watching from my car as the sun set behind the building. My phone was off. The nursing staff had been calling for 3 hours. I let it ring, and ring, and ring, until finally, silence. She died alone. Exactly as she deserved. And before you judge me, before you tell me I'm a monster for letting an 86-year-old woman die without family at her bedside, let me tell you what she did to my mother. Let me tell you about the 43 years of systematic psychological torture that started before I was even born and didn't end until the day my mom finally, mercifully, closed her eyes for the last time at 59 years old. My grandmother didn't use her fists. She never had to. She was far too sophisticated for that. Margaret Eleanor Whitmore was a master of the slow kill, the kind that happens with words, with silence, with strategic cruelty disguised as concern. The kind that leaves no bruises anyone can see, but destroys you from the inside out like cancer. I'm 34 now. And for 31 of those years, I watched my mother shrink. I watched her apologize for existing. I watched her believe she was worthless because that's what her own mother told her, every single day, in 1,000 different ways. This is the story of how I made sure Margaret Eleanor Whitmore understood, in her final moments, exactly what she'd done. The first memory I have of my grandmother is from when I was 3 years old. We were at her house, a pristine colonial in Westchester with white carpets that nobody was allowed to walk on and furniture that existed purely for show. My mother was 28, still beautiful then, before the years of anxiety carved permanent lines into her face. She was wearing a yellow sundress. I remember the yellow because of what came next. My grandmother was hosting a luncheon. That's what she called them, luncheons, not lunch. Everything about Margaret was performative, carefully curated for an audience that existed mainly in her own head. She needed people to see her as refined, successful, the perfect matriarch. My mother was helping in the kitchen, arranging finger sandwiches on a silver platter. I was coloring at the table, trying to be quiet like Mom had asked. One of my crayons rolled off the edge, and without thinking, I chased it across the white carpet. The red crayon left a small streak. Maybe 3 inches long. I froze. My mother's face went completely white. She rushed over, dropping to her knees, frantically trying to rub it out with her napkin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, over and over. "I'm so sorry, Mother. I should have been watching her. I'll fix it. Of course you should have been watching her." My grandmother's voice was ice. She didn't raise it. She never had to. But then again, Catherine, you've never been particularly attentive to details, have you? Remember the vase? The Christmas dinner? Your entire childhood? My mother was crying now, still scrubbing at the carpet. Her yellow dress had a dark wet spot where tears were falling. I wanted to tell her it was my fault, but I couldn't speak. Something about the way my grandmother was standing there, arms crossed, watching my mother grovel, made my 3-year-old brain understand that speaking would make things worse. You know what the real tragedy is? My grandmother continued, examining her manicured nails. I had such high hopes for you. But you've always been a disappointment, haven't you? Can't even manage your own child. How you convinced someone to marry you, I'll never understand. My father wasn't there that day. He was never there for these moments. He worked in finance, traveled constantly, and when he was home, he existed in a separate reality where my grandmother's cruelty was just how Margaret is, and my mother's resulting anxiety was Catherine being dramatic. That day, my mother spent 2 hours on her knees, scrubbing that carpet. The guests arrived. She served them with red eyes and a trembling smile. My grandmother told everyone about the little accident and how poor Catherine just can't seem to keep things together. Nobody defended my mother. They laughed. Politely, sympathetically, but they laughed. That's the thing about my grandmother. She never attacked my mother in private. She made sure there was always an audience. The humiliation was the point. I didn't understand what I was witnessing back then. Kids don't. To me, my mother was magic. She could make pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse. She knew all the words to every Disney song. She stayed up late making costumes for my school plays. She was warm and soft and smelled like vanilla. But she was also constantly apologizing. She apologized when dinner was 5 minutes late. She apologized when it rained on days we'd planned to go to the park. She apologized for asking my dad to pick up milk on his way home. She apologized for being tired, for being hungry, for existing in a way that might inconvenience anyone. And every Sunday, we went to my grandmother's house. Those Sundays have blurred together in my memory now, but certain moments stand out with painful clarity. I was 7 when my grandmother started the weight conversations. My mother had gained some weight after having my younger sister, Emma. She wasn't even overweight, she'd gone from a size 4 to a size 8. But to my grandmother, this was a moral failing. "Catherine, darling, I found this wonderful article about portion control," she'd say, sliding a magazine across the table. "I thought of you immediately." Or, "That dress is lovely, but perhaps something a bit more forgiving? Around the middle?" Or, "My personal favorite, you know, your sister Elizabeth is training for a marathon. But then again, she's always been the disciplined one." My mother would smile tightly and change the subject. Then she'd stop eating for the rest of the day. I watched her relationship with food become a battleground. She'd make us elaborate, delicious dinners, then eat a tiny portion herself while my grandmother's words echoed in the kitchen like ghosts. Too much. Too lazy. Too weak. No discipline. By the time I was 10, my mother had developed a full-blown eating disorder. She'd hide in the bathroom after meals. I'd hear her crying, the sound of running water trying to cover other sounds. My father never noticed. Or if he did, he never said anything. My grandmother noticed. Of course she noticed. She was pleased. The summer I turned 12, my grandmother decided my mother needed to get out more and meet people. This was code for, "You've let yourself go and your husband is going to leave you if you don't fix it." My grandmother enrolled my mother in a tennis club. Not because my mother liked tennis, she'd never expressed any interest. But because Margaret belonged to that club, and having her daughter there, under her watchful eye, gave her more opportunities for public correction. I went along sometimes, sitting in the shade with a book while my mother took lessons. She was bad at tennis. Coordination had never been her strength. But she tried so hard. She showed up every week in the white tennis skirt my grandmother had bought her, one size too small, motivation to slim down. And she'd swing the racket with determination even as the other women in the club, Margaret's friends, exchanged meaningful looks. One afternoon, after a particularly rough lesson, we were in the locker room. My mother was changing, and I was sitting on the bench, swinging my legs. One of the other women, a brittle blonde named Patricia, walked past and paused. "Catherine, honey," she said, with that sickly sweet tone people use when they're about to say something cruel. "I have to ask. Have you considered maybe taking up something less strenuous? Like yoga? Or even just walking?" My mother's hands froze on the buttons of her shirt. Patricia continued, "It's just, you seem to be struggling out there, and at our age, we have to be realistic about our limitations, don't we?" My grandmother materialized from around the corner. Like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Patricia makes an excellent point," she said. "Catherine, perhaps this was too ambitious. You've always had trouble sticking with things when they get difficult." My mother's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm trying, Mother." "Are you?" My grandmother tilted her head. "Because trying would involve actually improving, wouldn't it? This seems more like showing up to fail publicly." I remember the exact sound of my mother's breath catching. I remember her hands shaking as she finished buttoning her shirt. I remember walking to the car in silence, and how she sat in the driver's seat for 10 full minutes before she could stop crying enough to see the road. She never went back to the tennis club. My grandmother told everyone my mother had quit because it was too hard, adding that it was typical Catherine to give up. High school is when I started to understand that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Not just with my mother's relationship with her mother, but with how everyone around us seemed to think this was normal. Acceptable. Just family dynamics. I was 14 when my mother had a panic attack at Thanksgiving dinner. We were at my grandmother's house, as always. The dining room was elegant, crystal chandelier, china that cost more than our monthly mortgage, flower arrangements that looked like they belonged in a magazine. My grandmother was at the head of the table in a burgundy dress that probably cost 4 figures. My mother was in navy blue, sitting with her hands folded in her lap, shoulders hunched like she was trying to take up less space. My Aunt Elizabeth was there with her husband and their 2 perfect children. Elizabeth was everything my mother wasn't: thin, successful, married to a surgeon, living in a house that looked like a Pottery Barn catalog. She was also, notably, my grandmother's favorite. Margaret never missed an opportunity to point out the contrast. Dinner started normally enough. My grandmother criticized the turkey, a bit dry, Catherine, but then you always did have trouble with timing. My father ignored it, focusing on his wine. My aunt smiled sympathetically in that way that wasn't sympathetic at all. Then my grandmother brought out the family photo album. I was organizing the attic, she announced, and I found all these wonderful old photos. Look at this one. Elizabeth at her college graduation. Summa cum laude. We were so proud. She passed it around. Elizabeth looked radiant in the photo, cap tilted at a perfect angle, confident smile. And here's Catherine's graduation. The photo showed my mother, notably heavier than Elizabeth, squinting in the sun, her cap slightly askew. She looked uncomfortable. My grandmother had somehow managed to capture the worst possible moment. You can see the difference in their approaches to life, can't you? My grandmother mused. Elizabeth always knew what she wanted. Catherine, well. She tried. I watched my mother's breathing change. Quick, shallow breaths. Her face was flushing red. And here's both girls at the shore. Goodness, Catherine, do you remember when you insisted on wearing that bikini? Despite me trying to gently suggest a one-piece? You were so headstrong back then. Thought you knew better than your mother. My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She pressed a hand to her chest. I can't. Catherine, sit down, my grandmother said sharply. You're making a scene. I can't breathe. My mother's voice was strangled. I need to. She stumbled toward the bathroom. I followed her, ignoring my grandmother's protests. I found my mother sitting on the bathroom floor, back against the bathtub, hyperventilating. Her eyes were wild, unfocused. She clutched at her shirt like she was trying to claw her way out of her own skin. I was 14 years old, and I didn't know what to do. I sat next to her. I took her hand. I counted breaths like I'd seen in a TV show once. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. It took 20 minutes for her breathing to return to normal. 20 minutes while we could hear my grandmother in the dining room, telling everyone that Catherine was having one of her episodes and that she'd always been overly emotional, even as a child. When we finally emerged, my father was ready to leave. Not because he was concerned, he just wanted to avoid the embarrassment. In the car, my mother apologized. To my father. To me. To Emma, who was only 9 and confused about why Thanksgiving had ended early. She apologized for ruining the holiday. For being dramatic. For not being stronger. My father said nothing. He just drove, jaw tight, angry that his wife had embarrassed him in front of his mother-in-law. That was the night I started to hate my grandmother. Really, truly hate her. But I was 14. What could I do? College couldn't come fast enough. I went to Northwestern, partially for the excellent journalism program, but mostly to get away from the toxic ecosystem that was my family. I thought distance would help my mother. I thought maybe without me there to witness the daily erosion of her self-worth, she might find the strength to set boundaries. I was wrong. My grandmother ramped up the attacks. Phone calls became weapons. She'd call my mother daily, sometimes multiple times a day, with a litany of criticisms disguised as concern. I saw Janet Henderson at the market today. She asked about you. I didn't know what to say. What have you been doing with yourself, Catherine? You don't work, you don't volunteer, you barely leave the house. Your sister's son just got accepted to Princeton. Full scholarship. Of course, Elizabeth raised him to value education. I suppose everyone has different priorities. I called 3 times yesterday and you didn't answer. Were you avoiding me? Why would you avoid your own mother? After everything I've done for you. My mother would call me after these conversations, crying, and I'd spend hours trying to rebuild the foundation my grandmother had just demolished. She's wrong, Mom. You're not worthless. You're not a failure. But the words felt hollow because we both knew she'd be back at my grandmother's house on Sunday, enduring it all over again. Why do you keep going? I asked once, frustration bleeding into my voice. Why do you keep letting her do this to you? My mother was quiet for a long time. Then, she's my mother. As if that explained everything. As if biology gave someone the right to destroy you slowly. I was 21 when my mother tried to kill herself for the first time. I was home for spring break. I'd gotten in late the night before and slept until noon, exhausted from finals. When I woke up, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I found my mother in the bathroom. She'd taken pills. A lot of them. The empty bottles were lined up on the counter with disturbing precision. Sleeping pills, anxiety medication, painkillers left over from a dental procedure. She was slumped against the bathtub, eyes half closed, barely conscious. I called 911. I don't remember doing it, but I must have because suddenly there were paramedics in our house, lifting my mother onto a stretcher, asking me questions I couldn't answer. How many pills? When did she take them? Did she leave a note? There was no note. At the hospital, after they'd pumped her stomach and stabilized her, the doctor pulled me aside. This wasn't a cry for help, he said quietly. The amount she took, she meant to die. Your mother needs serious psychiatric help. She was admitted to the psychiatric ward for 72 hours. Mandatory hold. I stayed with her as much as they'd let me, sitting beside her bed while she stared at nothing. On the second day, she finally spoke. I'm sorry. Mom, don't. I'm so sorry, she continued, tears sliding down her face. I can't do it anymore. I'm so tired. I'm tired of being wrong all the time. Tired of disappointing everyone. Tired of taking up space I don't deserve. That's not true. None of that is true. My mother says. Your mother is destroying you. The words exploded out of me. Can't you see that? Everything she says, everything she does, it's designed to make you feel like this. She wants you to feel worthless. My mother looked at me with such profound sadness. Why would my own mother want that? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Some people are just broken in ways that make them need to break others. When my grandmother found out about the suicide attempt, she didn't visit the hospital. She called my father and said, "This is exactly the kind of attention-seeking behavior Catherine's always exhibited. She's fine. She's just being manipulative." Manipulative. That's what she called my mother's attempt to end her own life. My father, to his eternal shame, seemed to agree. He was embarrassed. His wife had tried to kill herself, and all he could think about was what people would say. After my mother was released, there was no family meeting. No intervention. No acknowledgement that something was catastrophically wrong. My grandmother called the day after my mother got home. "Catherine, I need you to help me organize a luncheon next month. The garden club is meeting here, and you know how particular I am about the flowers." Life just continued. As if nothing had happened. My mother's therapist recommended she set boundaries with my grandmother. "You don't owe her unlimited access to your life," the therapist said during one of the family sessions I attended. "You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to protect yourself." My mother nodded, wiping her eyes. "You're right. I know you're right." She lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks of not answering every phone call. 2 weeks of declining Sunday dinners. 2 weeks of trying to exist separately from her mother's sphere of influence. Then my grandmother showed up at our house unannounced. I was there when it happened. Home for the summer between junior and senior year. I watched through the window as my grandmother got out of her car, dressed immaculately as always, carrying a tray covered with aluminum foil. My mother's face went pale. "She's here," she whispered. "She's here. What do I do?" "Don't let her in." But even as I said it, I knew it was useless. My mother was already walking to the door, her spine literally curving as if pulled by an invisible string. She opened the door. "Catherine. Darling. I brought your favorite, my lemon bars. You've been avoiding me," and I thought, well, clearly something is wrong. A mother knows when her daughter is suffering. My grandmother swept into the house without waiting for an invitation. "Now, let's sit down and you can tell me what this is all about. All this childish avoiding. I assume that therapist of yours is filling your head with nonsense?" My mother stood frozen in the entryway. "She's not, it's not nonsense, Mother. I just need some space. Some time to work on myself." "Space?" My grandmother set down the lemon bars and turned, eyebrows raised. "Space from your own mother? Catherine, that's absurd. I'm the only one who's always been there for you. When everyone else gave up on you, who was there? When you were struggling with your weight, with your marriage, with basic functioning, who tried to help you?" "Help?" The word came out strangled. "You call that help?" "Of course it's help. Someone needs to be honest with you. Your father certainly never was. He coddled you, let you think you were perfect exactly as you were, and look how that turned out. You can barely manage your own household. Your husband works constantly because he can't stand to be around you. Your children will leave and never look back because who would want to stay near such a victim?" I stepped forward. "That's enough." My grandmother looked at me as if noticing me for the first time. "Oh, Samantha. You're home. How lovely. Perhaps you can talk some sense into your mother. Get out." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Get out of our house." My grandmother's face hardened. "How dare you speak to me that way? Catherine, are you going to let your daughter be this disrespectful?" My mother was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, but she wasn't moving. She wasn't defending me, but she wasn't defending her mother either. She was just frozen. "Mom can't do it," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "She can't tell you to leave because you've spent her entire life training her to think she doesn't have that right. But I can. And I am. You are not welcome here. Leave." My grandmother drew herself up. "Fine. But Catherine, remember this, when this little rebellion is over, when you realize you need me, I may not be so forgiving. Family is everything, darling. Cut me out, and you'll have nothing." She left, taking her lemon bars with her. My mother collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. "I'm so weak," she gasped. "I can't even stand up to my own mother. What's wrong with me?" "Nothing is wrong with you. She's the one who's broken." But I could see it in my mother's eyes, she didn't believe me. She believed my grandmother. After 40+ years of conditioning, how could she not? The boundary lasted 6 weeks this time. Then my grandmother was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. The diagnosis was real, I saw the medical records later. But the way my grandmother weaponized it was masterful in its cruelty. She called my mother at 11 at night. "Catherine, I need you to know," the doctor called. "It's cancer. Breast cancer. I'm going to die, and I'll die knowing my own daughter abandoned me in my time of need." My mother was on the phone for 3 hours. I could hear her from my room, the desperate apologies, the frantic promises to be there, to help, to make it up to her. By morning, we were back in my grandmother's orbit. Tighter than ever. Doctor's appointments. Chemotherapy sessions. Endless errands and phone calls and emotional support for a woman who had never once provided emotional support in return. My mother moved in with my grandmother during treatment. Temporarily, she said. Just until Margaret was back on her feet. She never moved back out. My father didn't fight it. He seemed almost relieved to have the house to himself. He'd been checking out of the marriage for years anyway, this just made it official without the messiness of divorce. I finished college. Got my first job at a newspaper in Chicago. Visited home every few months and watched my mother disappear a little more each time. She'd lost weight again. Too much weight. Her hair was going gray, but she couldn't afford to keep up with coloring it because every spare dollar went to helping my grandmother, whose cancer treatment was covered by insurance but who still needed constant financial help for mysterious expenses that never quite added up. My mother looked like a ghost haunting my grandmother's pristine colonial. And my grandmother? She beat the cancer. Of course she did. Women like Margaret don't die. They just keep going, fueled by spite and the satisfaction of having broken everyone around them. I was 25 when I truly understood that my mother was never going to escape. Some people can't. The damage goes too deep. The programming is too complete. My mother had been so thoroughly convinced of her own worthlessness that she genuinely believed she deserved everything my grandmother did to her. She thought the constant criticism was tough love. She thought the public humiliation was just her mother being honest. She thought her own suffering was earned. The worst part? She'd started to redirect it. Emma and I had both grown up watching this dynamic, but we'd responded differently. I'd gotten angry. I'd fought back. I'd gotten out. Emma had internalized it. By the time she was 16, she was already showing the signs. Apologizing constantly. Asking permission to exist. Developing the same fraught relationship with food that our mother had. I tried to intervene. I really did. Emma, you don't have to be like her. You don't have to let them do this to you. But Emma would just look at me with these sad, resigned eyes. If I don't make them happy, who will love me? That sentence haunts me still. My sister, at 16, had already accepted that love was conditional. That she had to earn it by being small, compliant, self-erasing. I blamed my grandmother. But I also blamed my mother for passing on the poison. That's the thing about generational trauma, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads. My grandmother had destroyed my mother, and my mother, despite trying desperately not to, was destroying my sister. I moved to New York when I was 27. Editor position at a digital magazine. Good salary. Great apartment in Brooklyn. A life that was fully mine. I still called my mother every week. The conversations were always the same. How are you, Mom? Oh, fine. Mother needed me to take her to the cardiologist this week. And then we had the garden club luncheon. And her bridge group. I've been so busy. What about you? Are you doing anything for yourself? A pause. This is for me. Taking care of Mother is important. Mom, you've been taking care of her for 6 years now. When does it end? She needs me. You need you. But it was like talking to a wall. My grandmother had won. Completely and utterly. By this point, my mother was 53. She looked 70. Her hair was fully gray, skin papery, hands constantly trembling. She was on a cocktail of medications for anxiety, depression, insomnia. She rarely left my grandmother's house except for errands. My grandmother, conversely, was thriving. She'd made a full recovery from cancer, joined more clubs, traveled to Europe twice. She had a boyfriend, some retired lawyer who thought her spirit was refreshing. She'd say things like, "I'm so blessed to have Catherine. She's devoted her life to me." Not many daughters would be so selfless. Selfless. As if my mother had a choice. As if this arrangement was anything other than a hostage situation. I was 29 when I decided I was done. Not with my mother, I could never be done with her. But with my grandmother. It started small. I stopped attending the obligatory family gatherings. Christmas. Easter. The birthday luncheons where Margaret held court and my mother served. "Samantha isn't coming," I'd hear my grandmother say on the phone to her friends, voice dripping with false concern. "She's always been so career-focused. I worry she's going to end up alone." But what can you do? Some girls are just born that way. I didn't care what she said about me. I was beyond her reach. But Emma wasn't. Emma had graduated college and moved back home. Not to our father's house. He'd since moved to Florida with a new girlfriend, but to my grandmother's house. Where my mother was. Where the poison was concentrated. She told me she was saving money, but we both knew the truth. She was following the pattern. The terrible, predictable pattern of women in our family being drawn into my grandmother's orbit and never escaping. I called Emma one night, after too much wine. "You have to get out. I can't just leave Mom there alone with her." "Then make Mom leave too." "She won't. You know she won't." Emma's voice was flat. Defeated. "This is just how it is. It doesn't have to be. Doesn't it? Look at us, Sam. Look at what she's made us. Mom's destroyed. I'm miserable. You ran away to New York and pretend we don't exist half the time. She won. I didn't run away. I left. Same thing." That conversation broke something in me. Because Emma was right. My grandmother had won. She'd taken my mother's entire life, and now she was taking Emma's too. And what was I doing? I was living my nice life in Brooklyn, calling once a week, telling myself I couldn't help people who didn't want to be helped. But that wasn't true, was it? My mother wanted help. She just didn't know how to accept it. She'd been so thoroughly broken that she couldn't imagine life outside the cage. I started researching narcissistic personality disorder. Emotional abuse. Generational trauma. I read books. Articles. Forums full of people with stories like ours. Parents or grandparents who destroyed their children's self-worth with surgical precision, who played the victim while being the aggressor, who weaponized love until it became indistinguishable from hate. And I learned something important: people like my grandmother don't change. They don't have epiphanies. They don't suddenly realize the damage they've done and apologize. They just keep going until they die. My mother's second suicide attempt came 2 months after my 30th birthday. Emma found her. In the bathroom, again. Pills, again. This time it was closer. The doctor said another 10 minutes and they wouldn't have been able to save her. I got the call from Emma at 4 in the morning. She tried again. They're keeping her for evaluation, but... Sam, I don't know how much more of this I can watch. I was on the next flight to New York. At the hospital, my mother looked impossibly small in the bed. Tubes and wires. Monitors beeping. Her eyes were open but empty, staring at the ceiling. Mom. She didn't respond. I pulled a chair next to the bed. Took her hand. It felt like paper. Why? My voice cracked. Why do you keep trying to leave us? Finally, she spoke. Her voice was so quiet I had to lean in to hear. Because she's right. About everything. I'm worthless. I've wasted my whole life. I don't deserve. Stop. I squeezed her hand, probably too hard. Just stop. None of that is true. How do you know? Because I know you. You're kind. You're generous. You've spent your entire life trying to make other people happy. And I've failed at that too. No, Mom. You haven't failed. She failed. She failed at being the kind of mother who built her daughter up instead of tearing her down. She failed at being a decent human being. My mother finally looked at me. Her eyes were hollow. I'll never be free of her, will I? And in that moment, I realized something. She was right. As long as my grandmother was alive, my mother would never be free. The pull was too strong. The damage too deep. But maybe, I thought, there was another way. They kept my mother in the psychiatric facility for 3 weeks this time. During those 3 weeks, I stayed at my grandmother's house. She insisted, in that way she had of making demands sound like generous offers. You'll stay here, of course. We need to be close to the hospital. And I need support during this difficult time. My daughter attempting suicide, again. The embarrassment alone. I agreed. But not for the reasons she thought. I was gathering evidence. See, my grandmother was 78 at this point. She'd had cancer. She had heart issues. She was on several medications. And she kept meticulous records of everything, medical files, financial documents, legal papers. I started going through them. I wasn't sure what I was looking for at first. Proof, maybe. Evidence that could somehow explain or justify what I was beginning to plan in the darkest corners of my mind. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. My grandmother had been financially abusing my mother for years. Credit cards in my mother's name that Margaret had opened and maxed out. A second mortgage on our family's old house that my mother had co-signed for without understanding what it meant. Loans. So many loans. My mother, who hadn't worked in 20 years, who lived in my grandmother's house and depended on her for everything, was somehow $300,000 in debt. And the beneficiary of my grandmother's will? Not my mother. Not Emma and me. A cat charity. My grandmother was leaving everything, the house, the investments, all of it, to a cat rescue organization. My mother had sacrificed everything, and she was getting nothing. Not even the house she'd spent years maintaining. I sat in my grandmother's pristine office, surrounded by evidence of her cruelty rendered in financial documents, and something in me shifted. I'd spent years being angry. Years wanting to save my mother. Years hoping somehow things would change. But they wouldn't. Not while my grandmother was alive. And my mother wasn't strong enough to cut her off. She'd literally rather die. So I made a decision. I couldn't kill my grandmother. I'm not a murderer. But I could ensure that when she died, and at 78 with heart issues, that wouldn't be long, she died exactly as she'd lived. Alone. Unloved. Abandoned by everyone who was supposed to care. It took planning. I couldn't just cut my grandmother off myself. That wouldn't accomplish anything. She'd barely notice my absence, and besides, I needed to be subtle. Strategic. I needed to dismantle her support system piece by piece. My grandmother's social world was her lifeblood. She thrived on having an audience, people who saw her as sophisticated, generous, cultured. Her friends. Her clubs. Her church group. The neighbors who thought she was such a devoted mother to poor Catherine. I started with doubt. Small seeds of it, planted carefully. At my grandmother's next luncheon, I made sure to be there. Smiling. Helpful. Charming. Your grandmother is such a saint, one of her friends said to me. Taking care of your mother all these years. Taking care of? I tilted my head, confused. Oh, no. My mother takes care of her. Has for years. Honestly, I don't know what Grandma would do without Mom. She can barely manage on her own anymore. A subtle furrow between the friend's brows. Really? But Margaret always says. Oh, Grandma likes to put on a brave face. Pride, you know. But between you and me, her heart isn't what it used to be. And the memory issues, well. We don't like to talk about it. There were no memory issues. My grandmother was sharp as ever. But that wasn't the point. The point was to flip the script. To make people see my grandmother not as the martyred mother, but as the aging woman being cared for by her devoted daughter. I did this everywhere. With everyone. The bridge club, Grandma's so lucky Mom handles all the complicated stuff now. The medications, the bills. Grandma just gets confused by it all. The church group, Mom's been such a blessing, hasn't she? Grandma would be in a home without her. The neighbors, I worry about Grandma. She's so proud, she won't admit when she's struggling. Thank goodness for Mom. My grandmother noticed the shift. How people started treating her with a kind of pitying concern. How they spoke to her more slowly, more carefully. How they started asking my mother if Margaret was having a good day. She hated it. What are you doing? She demanded one night, after her friends had left early because Margaret seemed tired. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. You're making them think I'm senile. Dependent. That I need your mother instead of the other way around. I looked at her evenly. Isn't that what you've always told everyone? That Mom needs you? I'm just correcting the record. You vindictive little. Careful, Grandma. People are starting to notice how mean you are. They might think it's part of the decline. You know how elderly people sometimes lose their filter. I could see the rage in her eyes. But also something else. Something I'd never seen before. Fear. The financial abuse was harder to address. I couldn't just fix $300,000 in debt. But I could make sure it didn't get worse, and I could make sure my grandmother's culpability was documented. I hired a lawyer. Not for a lawsuit, that would take too long and stress my mother out more. But to go through everything, create a paper trail, and most importantly, to revoke my grandmother's access to my mother's financial information. My mother was too deep in her mental health crisis to handle it herself. So I got power of attorney, temporarily, while she was in the facility. I closed the credit cards. Froze the accounts. Documented every fraudulent charge. When my grandmother found out, she showed up at the hospital where my mother was staying, demanding to see her. The staff, who I'd briefed about the situation, turned her away. I'm her mother, my grandmother shrieked in the hallway. You can't keep me from my daughter. Actually, we can, the head nurse said calmly. Your daughter is here voluntarily, and she specifically requested no visitors except her children. My mother had requested no such thing. But she hadn't requested visitors either, and I'd filled in the blanks. My grandmother stood in that hallway, shaking with rage, and for the first time in her life, she had no power. This is your doing, she hissed at me when I came out. You're poisoning her against me. I don't need to poison her against you. You've done that yourself for 55 years. Everything I've done has been for her own good. To make her better. To help her. Help her? I laughed, hollow and bitter. You've destroyed her. She's tried to kill herself twice because of you. Because you've convinced her she's worthless. She is worthless. Look at her. She can't function without me. There it was. The truth she'd never quite said out loud before. The quiet part said loud. She can't function because you've spent her entire life making sure she can't. You need her to be dependent on you because without someone to torture, you're nothing. Just an old woman with money and no real friends. My grandmother's face twisted. For a second, I thought she might hit me. Instead, she drew herself up, gathered what remained of her dignity, and walked away. She tried calling my mother every day for a week. The hospital blocked her. She tried showing up. Security escorted her out. She sent letters. We threw them away unopened. For the first time in my mother's adult life, she had 3 weeks without her mother's voice in her head. It wasn't enough to heal her. Not nearly. But it was enough for her to start remembering what it felt like to breathe without someone's hand around her throat. My mother was released from the facility with a plan. Therapy 3 times a week. Medication adjustments. And, most importantly, a strong recommendation that she establish physical and emotional distance from her primary stressor. The therapist didn't name my grandmother specifically. She didn't have to. You need to create a life that isn't centered around someone else's needs, the therapist said. Start small. Find one thing that brings you joy, just for you. No justification needed. My mother nodded. She seemed more present than she had in years. Still fragile, still scared, but, there. I think. She started, then stopped. Started again. I think I need to move out of Mother's house. Emma and I both froze. We'd been hoping for this but hadn't dared suggest it. Where would I go? Mom continued, more to herself than us. I don't have money. I don't have a job. I haven't worked in 20 years. You can stay with me, I said immediately. In New York. My apartment's small, but we'll make it work. Or with me, Emma added. I just got a new place with a 2nd bedroom. My mother looked between us, tears forming. You'd want that? Even though I'm broken? You're not broken, Emma said fiercely. You're hurt. There's a difference. And even if you were broken, I added, you're our mom. You get to take up space. You get to need things. You get to exist without apologizing for it. My mother sobbed. But they were different tears than I'd seen before. Not tears of despair. Tears of something that might, eventually, become hope. She moved in with Emma 2 weeks later. We didn't tell my grandmother in advance. We just did it. Packed up my mother's things, which fit in 3 suitcases after 20 years of living there. She'd never been allowed to accumulate much, and left. My grandmother came home to an empty house. She called, of course. Called and called and called. My mother didn't answer. Catherine, this is ridiculous. You can't just leave without explanation. After everything I've done for you. Come back immediately. We can talk about this like adults. No. That was my mother's response. Just one word, delivered via text message, her hands shaking so badly Emma had to help her type it. No. My grandmother tried different tactics. Anger, you're ungrateful and selfish. Guilt, I'm old and sick, how could you abandon me? Bargaining, I'll change, we can go to family therapy. Threats, I'm changing my will, you'll get nothing. My mother turned off her phone. For the first month, she barely left Emma's apartment. She was terrified my grandmother would find her. Would show up. Would somehow pull her back in. But she didn't. Because I made sure my grandmother was too busy dealing with other problems. Remember how I'd been systematically dismantling my grandmother's social network? Making her seem dependent, confused, difficult? I escalated. I called her friends from time to time, concerned about her welfare. I'm just so worried. She's been so paranoid lately. Saying terrible things about my mother. It's sad, really. I think the loneliness is getting to her. Paranoid? What kind of things? Oh, conspiracy theories. She's convinced my mother stole from her, which is absurd. Mom has been nothing but devoted. But Grandma keeps calling her names, making accusations. The doctors think it might be the early stages of dementia. There were no doctors. No diagnosis. But the seed was planted. I contacted her bridge club and mentioned that my grandmother had been making errors in the game, getting confused about rules she'd known for decades, getting irritable when corrected. We're having her evaluated, I confided. But between you and me, we might need to look into memory care facilities soon. The bridge club started treating my grandmother differently. Gently. Carefully. Like she was fragile. She raged about it, which only made her seem more unstable. I leaked information about the financial abuse to her church group. Framed it as poor Margaret, she didn't understand what she was doing, opening those credit cards. The confusion, Suddenly people were concerned. Pitying. Some even judgmental. Elder abuse was serious, even if the elder was the perpetrator. Within 3 months, my grandmother's carefully cultivated social life had crumbled. Her friends still called occasionally, but with that overly kind tone people use with the elderly and infirm. Her clubs made excuses for why she couldn't participate. Her church asked her to step down from the Women's Auxiliary Board, just until things are settled. She was being isolated. Not physically, she could still leave her house, go places. But socially. Emotionally. She was alone in the way that matters most. And she knew I was doing it. She'd call me, screaming. "You're destroying my reputation. You're making everyone think I'm crazy." Am I? Or are people just finally seeing who you really are? Everything I did was for Catherine. To make her stronger. You destroyed her. You took a person who could have been happy and you systematically broke her down until she wanted to die. Twice. She was weak. She needed a mother who loved her. Not a sadist who got off on making her suffer. I hung up. She tried to turn it around. Tried to tell people I was the problem, that I was manipulating everyone, that I was the abuser. But by then, the narrative was set. And my grandmother, who'd spent her whole life caring desperately about appearances, couldn't handle being seen as anything less than perfect. She started making mistakes. Real ones. Born of stress and isolation. She'd forget appointments. Snap at people. Show up to events underdressed or overdressed because she was so focused on defending herself that she lost track of the details she'd always obsessed over. It would have been sad if she hadn't spent decades doing exactly this to my mother. My mother, meanwhile, was healing. Slowly. Painfully. With so many setbacks I lost count. But healing. She started with small things. Sleeping without medication. Eating meals without first calculating if she deserved them. Going for walks without apologizing for taking up space on the sidewalk. Emma and I took turns staying with her. We weren't trying to replace my grandmother's control with our own, we were just there. Present. Supportive without being smothering. We celebrated tiny victories. The day she laughed at something on TV without immediately looking guilty about it. The day she disagreed with me about something small, which movie to watch, without apologizing afterward. The day she said I want instead of if it's okay, maybe we could. Therapy was helping, but so was distance. Just not having my grandmother's voice in her ear every day, not having to brace for the next criticism, the next loving piece of advice that was really a dagger. Gave my mother space to remember who she'd been before. Or maybe not who she'd been. Maybe who she could have been. "I don't know who I am without her," my mother said one night, sitting on Emma's couch with tea cupped in both hands. "I've spent my whole life reacting to her. Trying to please her, then failing, then trying again. I don't know what I like. What I want. What makes me, me. So find out," Emma said gently. "You have time now. I'm 55 years old. Most people have themselves figured out by now. Most people weren't raised by Margaret, I pointed out. You're not behind. You're just starting fresh. My mother smiled. Small and uncertain, but real. Starting fresh at 55. That's kind of funny, actually. It was the first time I'd heard her find humor in her situation rather than despair. 6 months after my mother moved out, my grandmother had her first heart attack. Minor. A warning shot, the doctors said. She needed to reduce stress, take her medications, make lifestyle changes. She called my mother from the hospital. Catherine. I'm dying. I need you. My mother stared at her phone. I was there when it happened. We were at my place in New York, having dinner. She says she's dying, my mother whispered. She's not. She had a minor heart attack. She'll be fine. But what if? Even if she wasn't fine, you don't owe her anything. My mother was quiet for a long time. She's my mother. And you're her daughter. That should have meant something. Should have meant she protected you, supported you, loved you. But she didn't. She tortured you instead. Maybe if I'd been better. Stop. I took my mother's hands. There is no version of you that would have been good enough for her. That was never the point. She needed someone to break. It could have been anyone. It just happened to be you. My mother's eyes filled with tears. If I go to her, I'll never leave again. I know. But if I don't, if she dies and I wasn't there, then she dies alone. Like she deserves. It was harsh. But it was true. My mother called my grandmother back. Not because I forced her to, but because she needed to do it. Needed to say what she'd never been able to say. Mother, I'm not coming. Silence on the other end. I'm sorry you're in the hospital. I hope you recover. But I can't. I can't do this anymore. I can't sacrifice my life for someone who's never once valued it. Catherine, you ungrateful. My mother hung up. Then she turned off her phone, curled up on my couch, and cried for 2 hours straight. But she didn't go. My grandmother recovered from the heart attack, as predicted. She went home to her empty house. Hired a home health aide because she couldn't manage on her own anymore and none of us would help. She tried to reconcile. Letters. Gifts. Even a manipulative attempt at an apology. I'm sorry if you felt hurt by my efforts to help you. My mother didn't respond. For the first time in her life, my mother was holding a boundary. It wasn't easy. She'd panic sometimes, convinced she was being cruel. She'd second-guess herself daily. But she held it. And I kept working. My grandmother's health was declining naturally, she was almost 80, she'd had cancer and a heart attack. But I made sure she knew exactly what she'd lost. I'd send her pictures occasionally. My mother smiling. Laughing. At a museum. At a park. Living. No message attached. Just the picture. Proof that my mother could exist without her. Could even be happy. It destroyed my grandmother more than any insult could have. The call came 3 years after my mother had moved out. My grandmother had had another heart attack. A big one this time. She was in the ICU. They don't think she's going to make it, the nurse said. She's been asking for her daughter. I was the only family member they could reach. I'd made sure of that. My mother had changed her number and moved to a new apartment. Emma had blocked all my grandmother's contacts. I was the sole point of contact. And I was in control. I'll let her know, I told the nurse. I didn't. I drove to the hospital, parked in the lot, and waited. I thought about going in. Thought about standing at my grandmother's bedside and telling her exactly what she'd done. Listing every cruelty, every calculated blow, every moment she'd chosen to destroy instead of build. But that would have given her what she wanted, an audience for her final performance. So I stayed in my car. I turned off my phone so the staff couldn't call back. And I waited. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of my grandmother lying in that hospital bed, alone, probably confused about why nobody came. Why her daughter, her victim, her creation, her purpose, wasn't there. I like to think she understood, in those final hours. Understood that this was the consequence. That you can't spend a lifetime destroying someone and expect them to comfort you in death. But probably not. People like my grandmother don't do self-reflection. They die believing they were right. The nurse called my emergency backup number, Emma, around 8 p.m. Your grandmother passed. I'm so sorry. We tried to reach you all, but I'm sorry she had to go alone. Emma called me. She's gone. I know. You were there? In the parking lot. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, good. We held a small funeral. Just the three of us, me, Emma, and my mother. My grandmother had wanted a grand affair, of course. She'd planned it years ago, left detailed instructions in a folder labeled Final Arrangements. Cathedral service. Hundreds of guests. White roses. A string quartet. An open casket so everyone could see how beautiful she looked even in death. We ignored all of it. We cremated her. Simple service at a funeral home chapel. No flowers. No guests. No eulogy painting her as a saint. The funeral director seemed uncomfortable with the sparse turnout. No other family? Friends from her church or clubs? No, I said simply. We didn't explain. We didn't owe anyone an explanation. My mother sat in the front row, staring at the simple urn. She hadn't spoken since we'd arrived. Her face was blank, not sad, not relieved, just empty. When it was over, when the funeral director had given his generic words about celebrating a life well lived and handed us the urn, my mother finally spoke. Can we go to the beach? Emma and I exchanged glances. Of course, I said. We drove to Cape Cod. To a beach my mother remembered from childhood, before everything got complicated. Before my grandmother's cruelty had crystallized into the pattern that defined my mother's life. We came here once, my mother said as we walked across the sand, the urn heavy in my hands. I was maybe 7. Mother was different that day. Lighter. She laughed at something Daddy said. Built a sandcastle with me. Let me get messy without criticizing. What happened? Emma asked. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe she was just having a good day. But I remember thinking, this is what it could be like. This is who she could be if she wanted to. My mother stared out at the waves. But she didn't want to. Or couldn't. I guess it doesn't matter which. We stood there for a while, the three of us, the ocean wind whipping our hair. Do you want to say anything? I asked, holding out the urn. My mother took it. Held it against her chest. Closed her eyes. I wanted you to love me, she said quietly. That's all I ever wanted. And you couldn't. Or wouldn't. And I spent my whole life trying to figure out what was wrong with me that made me unlovable. But it wasn't me, was it? It was never me. She opened the urn. I forgive you, she said. Not because you deserve it. But because I deserve to be free. And then she scattered the ashes into the ocean. Let the wind take them. Let them dissolve into nothing. We didn't stay to watch them disappear. We turned around and walked back to the car, leaving my grandmother in the waves behind us. Dealing with the estate was complicated. My grandmother had, in fact, left everything to that cat charity. The house, the investments, the savings. All of it. But remember that financial abuse I'd documented? The $300,000 in debt my grandmother had fraudulently accumulated in my mother's name? I handed all of that documentation to our lawyer. Can we contest the will based on this? I asked. He reviewed the files. Credit card statements. Loan applications. Bank records. All showing my grandmother's signature forging my mother's name, or instances where she'd clearly coerced my mother into signing things she didn't understand. Absolutely, he said. This is elder financial abuse in reverse. Your grandmother exploited your mother's vulnerability and psychological dependence. We can make a strong case that she owes your mother's estate restitution. The lawsuit took 2 years. The cat charity fought back, of course. They didn't want to lose $1 million bequest. But the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern of abuse was clear. And when Emma testified about finding my mother after her suicide attempts, when the therapists testified about the psychological damage, when the financial forensics expert explained the sophisticated manipulation, we won. Not all of it. The court ruled that my mother was entitled to enough from the estate to cover the fraudulent debt plus damages. About $450,000. The cat charity got the rest. My mother didn't want the money at first. It feels wrong, she said. Like I'm profiting from her death. You're not profiting, I explained. You're being compensated for what she stole. From you. This is justice, not a windfall. Eventually, she accepted it. Paid off the debt. Put the rest in savings. What will you do with it? Emma asked. My mother smiled. Small, but genuine. I'm going to take an art class. I always wanted to paint, but mother said it was frivolous. A waste of time. She paused. And maybe I'll travel. There are places I've wanted to see. Places that exist outside of her orbit. It's been 5 years since my grandmother died. My mother is 60 now. She looks younger than she did at 55. The constant tension has left her face. She smiles easier. Laughs more. She never became the person she might have been if my grandmother hadn't broken her. Too much damage for that. She still struggles with anxiety, with self-doubt, with the voice in her head that sounds like Margaret, telling her she's not enough. But she's learning to argue back. She took that art class. Turns out she's talented, really talented. She's had 2 gallery showings now. Small venues, local artists, nothing grand. But people buy her work. Tell her it's moving, beautiful, raw. She's dating someone. A kind, quiet man who teaches history at a community college. He knows her story. Not all of it, but enough. He's patient with her panic attacks, her bad days, her need for constant reassurance that he's not going to leave. I never thought I'd have this, she told me last month. A life that's mine. Where I get to want things and have them. Emma moved to California. Got married. Has a daughter now, my niece, who will grow up knowing she's loved unconditionally, no strings attached. Emma's in therapy too, working through her own inheritance of pain. Breaking the cycle for the next generation. And me? I'm still in New York. Still writing. I covered the story of financial abuse for my magazine, anonymously, hoping it might help someone else recognize the pattern in their own family. I don't regret what I did. People ask me sometimes, when the story comes up in vague terms, whether I feel guilty for letting my grandmother die alone. I don't. She lived alone. Emotionally alone. Even when surrounded by people, she was isolated by her own cruelty, her own inability to connect without dominating. She died the same way. And my mother got to live. That's the trade I made. My grandmother's comfortable death versus my mother's survival. I chose my mother. I'd choose her again. There's a photo on my desk. It's from 6 months ago. My mother's art show opening. She's standing in front of one of her paintings. A seascape, all blues and grays and whites, with a single figure on the shore, back to the viewer, facing the ocean. The figure is small. Vulnerable. But still standing. My mother is smiling in the photo. Really smiling. The kind of smile that reaches her eyes. Emma's next to her, holding her daughter. I'm on the other side, arm around both of them. We look like a family. A real one. Not the performance my grandmother demanded, where everyone played their role and smiled on cue. A family that chose each other. That supports each other. That allows each other to take up space and make mistakes and be imperfect without punishment. My grandmother isn't in the photo, obviously. But in a way, she is. She's the absence. The ghost. The empty space we all learned to navigate around for so long that we forgot what it was like to stand upright. Sometimes I still dream about her. About that parking lot. About watching the sun set while my phone buzzed with calls I didn't answer. In the dreams, I sometimes go inside. Sometimes I stand at her bedside. Sometimes I tell her exactly what she did, force her to hear it before she dies. But then I wake up, and I remember, the cruelest thing I could do to her wasn't confrontation. It was leaving her alone with the consequences of who she'd chosen to be. Last week, my mother called me. I've been thinking, she said. About forgiveness. About what I said at the beach. Yeah? I don't know if I really forgive her. I think I just wanted it to be over. Wanted to be done carrying the weight of hating her. That's okay. Forgiveness isn't required. No? No. You survived her. That's enough. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then, Sam? Yeah, Mom? Thank you. For protecting me. Even when I couldn't protect myself. My throat tightened. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do. You made sure she died alone. And I know people would judge that. Would say it was cruel. But it wasn't. It was justice. Mom. Let me finish. You gave me something she never could. You showed me that I was worth protecting. Worth fighting for. Worth more than she ever let me believe. She paused. I spent my whole life thinking I didn't deserve to be loved. And then you proved me wrong. By refusing to let her have me, even in death. I was crying now. Silently, but crying. I love you, Mom. I love you too. And Sam? I'm proud of who you are. The strength you have. The way you stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. You didn't learn that from your grandmother. You learned it in spite of her. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, looking at that photo. 3 women. 3 generations of damage and resilience. My grandmother broke my mother. I broke the cycle. And my niece? She'll grow up never knowing what it's like to be small in the face of someone who's supposed to love you. Never apologizing for existing. Never doubting her worth. That's the real ending to this story. Not my grandmother dying alone in a hospital room. But my mother, at 60, learning to paint. Emma, in California, teaching her daughter that no means no and yes means yes and maybe means you're allowed to change your mind. Me, writing this, hoping it helps someone else recognize the pattern before it destroys them. My grandmother ruined my mother's life. But she didn't get to ruin the ending. We took that back. We took it all back. And when I die, hopefully decades from now, surrounded by people who love me genuinely and not out of obligation, I won't die alone like she did. I'll die knowing I broke the chain. I'll die knowing I chose love over cruelty. I'll die knowing that the last thing my grandmother saw wasn't her daughter's face, but the consequences of a lifetime spent weaponizing that love. Some people will call me heartless for that choice. Those people never watched someone they loved try to kill themselves because they couldn't escape their abuser. Those people never had to choose between mercy for a monster and survival for a victim. Those people never had to be the villain in someone else's story so they could be the hero in their mother's. I made my choice. I let my grandmother die alone. And I'd do it again. Every single time. Because my mother deserved to live more than my grandmother deserved comfort in death. And that's not cruelty. That's love. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more powerful stories like these. Don't miss a single video.